All right, we're right at the 1 p.m. CST time. We're going to get started. All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to our very first official DEI training. For those who don't know, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're trying to do all three of those things. So, our very first topic is going to be on mental health intersectionality. So, this being Mental Health Month, we're going to focus in on the topic of mental health, but we're also going to give a brief overview of what is intersectionality, what is that word, where does it come from, what does it mean, how does it impact me. I know it's kind of a buzzword in the DEI community nowadays, but I don't know how many of you guys are aware of it or know what it means, so we're going to go into a definition first and foremost. Now, get started, we're going to set the stage with our agenda. Topics we're going to cover are what is intersectionality. The second section is going to cover specifics of several demographics. And then we're going to go into contributing factors. And then finally, we're going to end the afternoon with what can you do to help. Then we'll move into our Q&A there at the end. So first and foremost, what is intersectionality? So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Kimberly is known as the godmother of TED Talks. She's someone who's been giving speeches like this around campuses for a really long time, a pioneer in the women's movement, in the African American community, and a real powerhouse of a speaker. Basically, intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how a person's social and political identities combine and compound one another to different modes of discrimination and privilege. That's a really wordy way to say we all know that we're different. It's easy to say we're different, but why? Let's really drill down into that. Examples of these different factors include gender identity, social standing, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, weight, physical appearance, and height, along with many, many more. And these intersecting and overlapping social identities may be both empowering and oppressing. So, something to really think about here is what we're talking about in mental health and in all topics is often when you see a study or a statistic, it's talking about 40% of people are this, or 20% of white people are this. But we want to dig deeper into that. A statistic that helps me make sense of the concept of intersectionality is one that I was told in a conference that I attended with Deloitte. And Deloitte shared that at the time in 2019, women make 83 cents on the dollar versus men. Then, if we drill down further, Hispanic people make 80 cents on the dollar compared to white folks. But while 83 cents and 80 cents is a difference, what about if it's someone who's both? So a Hispanic woman actually makes 57 cents on the dollar compared to a man. So compared to a Caucasian man. So you can see where the intersectionality bit comes in because capturing that data as just a woman or just someone of Latin descent doesn't get us anywhere. I'm hearing that people can't see the slide. All right, so this is the information that I just went over, but next I'm going to show you this beautiful illustration. This actually was created by the folks that handle Kimberly Crenshaw's bookings these days. But if you see here, when we talk about overlapping and intersecting all of these different things, race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, religion, ability, all of these things. And then the quote from Kimberly says, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects, It's the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. And when we talk about discrimination and privilege, we also want to make sure that we highlight that both are possible in intersectionality. So in that example we were giving about Hispanic women making 57 cents on the dollar compared to a white cisgendered male, that white cisgender male, because he's all three of those things, experiences privilege. That's another piece of intersectionality. So now we're going to do a little bit of an exercise. I'm going to run through these topics, and as I pause on each one, I want you to personally think about, how do I answer this question? Where do I fit into this? We're not looking for answers in the chat. Just think about your own identity as we go through this, okay? So, what's your race? What's your ethnicity? Where do your people come from? What's your age? What about your salary? How do you identify with your gender? What's your sexual orientation? What's your political affiliation? What about your marital status? What about your level of ableness? How about your weight, your height, your job title? How high did you get with your education? What about your religion? Are you in touch with your religious side? Hair color? Eye color? What about the tone of your skin? Have you had any personal medical history, anything major that's happened to you? How about in your family? Where are you living right now? How does that compare to where you grew up? Are your parents still together? Are they still alive? Were you raised by your biological parents? Do you feel a connection to your cultural identity? Have you ever considered yourself an addict? Have you ever personally experienced violence? Have you ever been sexually harassed or assaulted? Let all those things sink in as we think about who we really are. Anything else come to mind that really makes you different than the person sitting next to you? Now, we've answered all those questions. Tell me, how similar do you feel to someone who only shares one of those traits with you, like race or gender? Not very, right? We're all really, really unique people, and all of these play a factor. That's intersectionality. So now we're going to talk about how it applies to mental health. I'm going to give you a lot of statistics, and we're going to go over some specific demographics and how it affects them. But as a starting point, the National Institute of Mental Health, they say that 1 in 5 U.S. adults live with a mental illness. In 2020, that was 52.9 million people. And while people of color have rates of mental health disorders similar to whites, these disorders are more likely to last longer and result in more significant disability for people of color. Now, I want to take a side note and talk about what we're going to use as language here. So, because of the length of the lesson we're doing here, I'm going to use some shorthand. Now, when I use the term white, that's shorthand for Anglo-Saxons of European descent, folks that you would generally categorize in your mind as white. When I use the term black, that doesn't just include African Americans. That's people of African descent or Caribbean descent that don't necessarily live in the United States. When I use the term Asian, typically I'm also referring to those who are Pacific Islanders. I want you to know that, especially as we get into the Q&A, this is a safe space. We're not here coming from a place of judgment, and any questions you bring to the table, we're going to treat them with respect so that we won't have judgment here and everybody's coming from a learning perspective and nothing is coming from an ill place. All right. Now, most mental illness goes untreated, especially in communities of color. We've got the graph here that shows us that 46% of whites with any mental illness received mental health services in 2015, compared to only 30% of blacks and 27% of Hispanics. So, what does that tell us? We're not really going out and being treated like we should for mental health. We stick to the old adage of suck it up, tough it out. Or we ignore it, or we don't admit it to ourselves. If only 46% on the high end and 27% on the low end of us are actually seeking treatment, that tells us something's wrong in the way we're thinking, right? So we need to approach that. Now, the first subset we're going to cover is children and teens. It's a question for the audience. What percentage of youth in the juvenile justice system do you think meet the criteria for a mental health disorder? How many kids that are in juvie do you think meet the criteria for a mental health disorder? I'll give you a second to think about it. And the answer here is as high as 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system meet the criteria for a mental health disorder. That's an absurdly high number. And unfortunately, it speaks to a larger topic that we're going to hit on in just a second. The other statistic I want to share here is that over 25% of black youth who have been exposed to violence have proven to be at high risk for PTSD. 1 in 4 black youth who have seen violence. It's a big number. PTSD is very serious. PTSD can lead to sleeplessness, stress, bipolar disorder, can even manifest itself in a fugue state. PTSD is a very scary disorder, and that's we're going to have more content about PTSD coming up in July when we've got PTSD Awareness Month. Now, when I talk about 75% of youth in the juvenile justice system meeting the criteria for a mental health disorder, I want to talk about a societal standpoint that's being taken that we need to work our best to try and combat. Society at large today takes the approach that the way to treat someone with a mental illness is to put them behind bars, where, yes, they're receiving treatment, but they're also being judged for actions that they may or may not have had in their mental control. And the treatment conversation tends to come through the lens of criminality. So what I would suggest, and what many in the mental health field would suggest, is that we as a country start to consider that the better option is rehabilitation, treatment over punishment. Now, we're going to talk about adults. Members of which racial group do you think are most likely to report having a mental health disorder? Do you think white folks are most likely to report having a mental health disorder, Asian Pacific Islanders, black folks, or none of these? I'll give you a second to think about it. Now, the answer here is tricky because it's none of the above. It's also partially all of the above. It's actually individuals identifying as being 2 or more races, mixed race folks. 24.9% of mixed race folks are reported to have a mental health disorder within the past year. That's a big number, right? Think of how many mixed race people you know. 1 in 4 have a mental health disorder. Followed by American Indian and Alaskan Natives at 22.7%, white folks at 19%, and black folks at 16.8%. Another note that we would make here is, note that the key word is report. How likely are they to report that they have a mental health disorder? There's a lot of factors that would stop people from reporting that, aren't there? So we think about stigmatization. We think about the societal norm of punishment over treatment. And that begins to make more sense why members of the black community wouldn't report having a mental health disorder, right? And then, as we spoke about on one of our early slides, while rates of depression are lower in blacks and Hispanics than in whites, depression in blacks and Hispanics is likely to be more disabling and persistent. And research behind that actually shows that while it's difficult to receive any sort of government assistance for depression or anxiety, it's actually incredibly difficult. But the black community and the Hispanic community are far more likely to be able to have all the documentation necessary to prove that their disabilities in these areas are serious enough to stop them from being able to work. So while the numbers of our different demographics are all relatively even for who's applying for these benefits, black folks and Hispanic folks are more likely to be approved because it's more likely that they're able to prove that theirs are more disabling and persistent. So what that means in practice with the studies that are shown is that on average, if a black person or a Hispanic person is suffering with depression, it's actually twice as long that they suffer as compared to a white person. There's lots of reasons for that. Could be not seeking treatment, could be something cultural that we've yet to understand. But it's important to note here that this is the situation we're in. Okay? Next question. Members of which racial group out of these four do you think are least likely to seek mental health treatment? Do you think Hispanics are least likely to seek mental health treatment? Black folks, Asian folks, or white folks? Give you a second to think about that. This one's not a trick question. It actually is one of these answers. And the answer is Asian Americans. In 2018, Asian Americans were 60% less likely, and Hispanic Americans 50% less likely to have received mental health treatment than non-Hispanic whites. That's a pretty serious number that tells a story all on its own. That Asian Americans are less likely to seek treatment for any mental health struggles that they have. The next statistic we want to share here is that American Indians and Alaskan Natives report higher PTSD and alcohol dependence rates than any other ethnic or racial group. And when we say that, it's significantly more. So they go through a lot of PTSD and alcohol dependence as a racial group, something we have to think about. Now we're going to touch on another demographic, and that's LGBTQ folks. So there's a lot of factors here, both societal and cultural, for LGBTQ folks, and we're going to dig into those. So a lot of statistics here, but this is just a general overview of LGBTQ folks and what they're going through mentally. 67% report that they've heard family members make negative comments about LGBTQ people, and that's in the past year. Not, I heard one time Uncle Bob say the F word. No. That's in the past year they've heard someone in their close family make a negative comment about LGBT people. That's 2 out of 3. 75% of LGBTQ teens report feeling significantly depressed. And the sadder statistic of that number is that LGBTQ teens who are still in their parents' homes, only 15% of them do their parents actually go and get them help for their depression. Leaves those kids feeling cut off, unheard, maybe not getting to the root of the issue there. 70% report feeling helpless or worthless in the last week. That's of all LGBTQ folks, not just teens. 70% is a big number. 95%, huge, massive number of LGBTQ youth report major trouble sleeping at night. They often lie awake in bed thinking, what could I do to change? Or what did I do wrong? Or how can I convince my parents that I'm normal, that I'm okay? Now, the next thing we're going to touch on is LGBTQ youth specifically. What percentage of LGBTQ plus youth report being harassed or physically assaulted in school? What do you think? 31%, 48%, 72%, or 86%? Some pretty high numbers on there. Give you a second to think about that. And the answer, unfortunately, again, is the highest number. A 2019 school climate survey showed that 86% of LGBTQ youth reported being harassed or assaulted at school. That's a shockingly high number when you think about how many kids in school are actually out of the closet. Because this would be specifically youth who are reporting that they are both LGBTQ and that they were harassed or assaulted, 86%. Only 26%, a little more than 1 in 4 LGBTQ students say they always feel safe in their classroom. Flip side of that is 74% of LGBTQ students say they don't always feel safe in their classroom. And just 5% say their teachers and school staff are supportive of LGBTQ people. That's a shockingly low number, which also explains the wave we're currently experiencing of sort of militancy among the LGBTQ youth. The need to congregate and make their voices heard because they don't feel supported. And something else we'll touch on briefly on LGBTQ stuff is we're currently also going through a political landscape with over 150 pieces of legislation being proposed this year, just in 2022, that would roll back rights or erase rights from LGBTQ people, and specifically targeting school-age kids. That is sort of seen as the equal and opposite reaction that everything happens in nature. As more and more kids identify as queer, more and more people push back against that. So something to keep in mind when you see a young, brave, queer person is to celebrate alongside them. They're fighting the good fight. They're just striving for equality like we all are. And equity, more importantly. Now we're going to talk about LGBTQ teens and young adults experiencing homelessness. How much more likely would you say that LGBTQ plus teens and young adults are to experience homelessness than their straight cisgender counterparts? Say they're 70% more likely than them, 100% more likely than them, 120% more likely than them, or 140% more likely? Give me a second to think about that. Now on this one, the answer is actually both C and D. So LGBTQ plus teens and young adults have a 120% higher risk of experiencing homelessness. That number rises to 140% higher risk if they are anything other than white. This young man with the poster holds up another devastating fact. 1 in 4 American youth will become homeless the day they come out. I want you to really think about that. Something that touches my heart very heavily. Maybe my keystone issue is LGBTQ plus homelessness. A lot of people don't know this, but it's something that the academics have deemed the silent generation of LGBTQ plus homeless. When I was working and living in Syracuse, New York, I took over a project where we were collecting clear shoebox sized boxes of goodies to give to LGBT homeless youth in the greater Syracuse area for Christmas, where they would get socks, gloves, maybe a journal, some dry shampoo, some wet wipes, anything to keep them clean and warm, a scarf, some gloves. And on the inside of every one of those boxes, I would inscribe a personal quote, a quote from one of my heroes, or do a little drawing. I'm not an artist by any means, but it was really the thought that counted there. And we were able to give a box to every registered LGBTQ homeless youth in the area. Now, at our local charity there, it was a charity by the name of ACR Health. If anybody's in the Syracuse area, they're a wonderful organization. Um, they're one of the few that actually would have the homeless youth who identified as queer register with them so that we could keep track of those numbers. In the greater Syracuse area, that number was 230. 230 children without homes because they were gay or trans, even more likely if they're trans. So I would urge you, if you have someone in your family who is gay or transgender, who is being excluded or disenfranchised from someone else in your family, just give them a hug, even if it's virtual. Tell them you love them. Tell them you support them. Ask them if they need anything. That little bit of support could be what stops them from living on the street. It's important. So that's your homework for today. Another statistic here, LGBT adults are nearly twice as likely, and transgender adults are almost 4 times as likely as heterosexual cisgender adults to experience a substance use disorder. Often in the queer community, we turn to drugs and alcohol. Sad but true fact. Unfortunately, culturally, it's also been that our only acceptable gathering places are bars. That's changing these days, but those numbers don't lie. Now we're going to talk about another subset, the military. Uh, the military has a long history of creating and trying their hardest to treat mental health disorders that stem from service. So here's our first question. How much more likely are those who served in the military to develop PTSD than your standard run-of-the-mill citizen like me? Think they're 3 times more likely, 10 times more likely, 15 times more likely, or 20 times more likely to develop PTSD? The answer there is actually, again, C and D. Those who served in the military are 15 times more likely than civilians to experience PTSD. For those who also identify as Black or Hispanic, it's 20 times more likely that they'll experience PTSD. We don't have many numbers like that on this slideshow because this shows a disproportionate amount, a majorly disproportionate amount of PTSD sufferers coming from our military community. Here's a stat that really shook me to my core. 1 in 3 people who didn't have a mental health disorder prior to their service in the military develop one within 4 months of being home. Coming home is sometimes the hardest part. And then we also have this term MST. 55% of women and 38% of men report being victim to sexual harassment while serving in the military. So much so that it has its own diagnosis. MST is military sexual trauma. It's a huge amount of people crossing the line sexually in the military. And a lot of people coming home with those traumas, which can also lead to PTSD. Something else to factor in is between 10 and 20% who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, our most recent wars, returned with a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. And those can impact your mental well-being in very profound ways. So in our next section, we're going to talk about suicide statistics. Suicide is not a topic I breach lightly, and this conversation comes with a trigger warning. In an effort to be understanding of all of our mental health journeys, if you need to mute the audio during this section, please feel free. No judgment. I'm not going into any graphic detail, but for some, talking about suicide is tough, and I want to acknowledge that. So, suicide. Suicide rates in black children ages 5 to 12 are nearly twice that of white children of the same age. I've added here the information for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's 1-800-273-TALK. I would encourage everybody to keep this number handy in your household because you never know when somebody's struggling. Now, this is the number you may have seen earlier in the month. We posted a statement of support for the new national program to create a new 3-digit number along the same lines as 911. This one's 988. 988 is going to direct you to this suicide prevention lifeline. This is the number you can call until that goes live in the middle of July. Once July hits, anytime you see someone having a mental health crisis or know someone having a mental health crisis, the number to give them is 988. Now, the next statistic is in 2019, suicide was the second leading cause of death for Black or African Americans aged 15 to 24. Second leading cause of death, with all the diseases we know of, with all of the gun violence we have in this country. Suicide, number 2. And for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders who are young adults aged 15 to 24, suicide was and still to this day is the leading cause of death. We also have seen it spike. From 1991 to 2019, self-reported suicide attempts rose nearly 80% among Black teens. And those numbers continued to rise through the coronavirus epidemic. And again, we touch back on military. This is another one that'll shake you right to your core. Military suicide rates are 4 times higher than the number of deaths that occurred during military operations. Pretty scary, isn't it? One more slide on this. We're going to talk about LGBTQ+. Teens and young adults are more than 4 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to their heterosexual peers. And the scariest number that we see on any suicide statistic, period, all over the world, is this one. 40%, almost half, of transgender adults have attempted to take their own life in their lifetime. That number in the general U.S. population is 5%. To me, 5% is high. 1 in 20 have attempted suicide. That's a big number. 40% is gigantic. So the next time you see a transgender adult out there living their life openly and proudly, take a moment to appreciate that they survived. And think about what you can do as an individual to make sure that they don't feel this way anymore. I've added here a number specific to LGBTQ crises. That's the Trevor Project, easily the best well-known crisis hotline for gay folks. The number's here, 866-488-7386. Now, we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about factors. What leads to this? So our first question is, what percentage of Black Americans say that they're very concerned about the stigma associated with mental illness? You think 15% say they're concerned about the stigma, 50% say they're concerned about the stigma, 70%, or 80%. That's those saying anything along the lines of, I can't admit that I'm mentally weak because showing weakness isn't accepted in my community. Or I can't admit that I'm struggling because of any of those cultural reasons. The answer here on this one is 80%. Unfortunately, we're back up to the highest number again. More than 80% of Black Americans are very concerned about the stigma associated with mental illness, which discourages them from seeking treatment. Black males with a mental health disorder are 7 times as likely to be incarcerated during a crisis than any other race. Think about that. Someone calls the police, or the black male themselves call the police. Having a mental health crisis, I'm freaking out, I don't know what to do. They're 7 times as likely than anyone else to be arrested in that situation and kept in jail. Something that shocked me about that statistic is that that same number, 7 times as likely, is the same statistic for veterans and active duty service members. They're 7 times as likely as a civilian to be incarcerated if someone calls the police or they call the police during a mental health crisis. Another major contributing factor, and this is pretty common knowledge, people know this is an issue that we have to deal with. The Black community comprises approximately half of the prison population, 40% of the homeless population, and 45% of children in the foster care system. Now, take into account the fact that Black Americans at their highest have accounted for almost 20% of our population in the United States. That's a very liberal estimate, is 20%. Those numbers don't add up, do they? 20% of our population, how are they 50% of the prison population, 40% of the homeless, and 45% of the children in the foster care system? And all of those situations make seeking appropriate and meaningful mental health treatment difficult or impossible. More contributing factors. Healthcare providers' lack of cultural understanding may contribute to underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis of mental illness in people of color. I stress to everyone, if you seek mental health treatment and you feel that you are not culturally understood by the person sitting on the other side of the table, seek more help. Has to be a fit. You're more likely to be underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed by someone that you don't feel understands your culture and where you're coming from. Language differences between patients and providers, stigma of mental illness in communities of color, and cultural presentation of symptoms can contribute to misdiagnoses. Now, when we say cultural presentation of symptoms, think about for a second your friends of different races and cultural backgrounds. If they were struggling with something like depression, would they show it in the same way? That's a no, right? And then we go to the approach to sexual orientation and gender identity in mental health care. One of our big problems there is that They often group together anyone in the LGBTQ plus community, when those communities are even considered at all. Often people are treated like just people, which we've learned in this intersectionality training can't be the case. We all come from a different place. And the LGBTQ plus community, while we strive to stand together, the differences between a lesbian and a gay man, the differences between a bisexual person and either of those individuals, the differences between a transgender person and somebody who identifies with a different sexual orientation. Those are different topics. We're talking about sexuality and gender identity. Somebody that identifies as any of the rest of the many identities that fall under that Q plus. They're not the same. Now we're going to talk about something we talked about earlier, that major contributing factor of punishment versus treatment. Now, I want to preface this by saying this is not a statement of anti-police or anti-justice system rhetoric. This is an open exploration of just the facts. That's all. Due to the stigma around mental health disorders and treatments, many in our society take the approach to punish rather than treat the mentally ill. We already talked about that. But these slides are going to cover 3 big statistics that I feel that everybody should know. Every year there's over 2 million jail admissions in the US for people with mental health needs. As a result, jails are the nation's largest behavioral health facilities. It's big. Jails are our #1 mental health treatment facilities. Problem with that. Out of all 50 states in the US, prisons and jails in 44 states have more people with mental health needs than the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital. More people with mental health needs in jail than in the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital. And that's in states that still have remaining psychiatric hospitals. We have some states, especially in the South, where if someone pleads insanity or is determined in their sentencing to need psychiatric help rather than jail, they have to be bused to another state. In 2015, 25% of all fatal police shootings involved a person with mental illness. Just think about that. 1 in 4 fatal police shootings involved someone who may not have had control over their mental faculties. Police are the first responders when confronting people with mental health needs, and unable to give proper care, officers' go-to response is arrest. In some instances, they are shot and killed. So how can we help? What can we do? All these seem like very big topics, and what can I do to have an impact? First off, develop an understanding of how our differences impact our journey of mental health. You can do that by attending courses like this, or just by searching out the information on your own. If you see somebody struggling, maybe it's important to do a little Googling about the few pieces of their intersectional identity that you do know, to see how does this affect people coming from their background, and also recognizing that their experience may be different than that. Encourage your elected officials to focus on treatment, not punishment, for those struggling with a mental health crisis. Part of that is encouraging use of the 988 number if you or someone you love is having a mental health crisis. It's important to actively show your friends, your employees, and your peers that conversations about mental health carry no stigma with you, and encourage conversations about mental health. It's so important to talk about mental health, especially to your supervisor, because they can help you and should help you craft a way of looking at your work, or understand that you might look at your work through a different lens than everyone else. Maybe it means you learn differently than other people. Maybe it means you organize your work differently than other people. But even if it's not you, if it's someone on your team, if they need the support to understand that how you do your work may be different for them, that's okay. There's no stigma there as long as the work is done. Then if somebody comes to you with a conversation about mental health, what are some general tips? First off, if someone isn't ready to talk, don't push it. It's important to gently and naturally let them know that you're always there for them and that you won't judge them. And then stick to that. Don't judge them. When engaged in a conversation about mental health, eliminate or ignore distractions and use your emotional intelligence to realize how difficult having this conversation must be. Ask open-ended questions and never second-guess someone's feelings or minimize their struggle. See somebody that's maybe acting a little extra, maybe somebody that's maybe going a little too hard about how hard work is. That's their struggle, not yours. Not your job to second guess that. What they're feeling is valid. And this is an important one that everybody struggles with. Unless you're a licensed professional, never attempt to diagnose someone. Even if you know someone with similar symptoms or struggles, even if it's you that has similar symptoms, especially if you can compare it to something you saw on television. Don't take that as a right to diagnose someone. Comparisons are more often than not unhelpful. Everyone has their own unique journey that deserves to be respected as unique. Now, I've got a couple slides here about what to do if you're hearing all of this and you're struggling. If you're struggling with mental health, don't be afraid to seek out help. Destroy that stigma in your mind. Go get the help you need. If you seek out help and don't feel culturally or personally understood, don't be afraid to do your research and shop around for a better fit. Better fits out there. If you're struggling with being culturally understood here in eXp, my door is always open. Come talk to me. That's not if you're struggling with being culturally understood at your psychiatrist, but in general, at work, in life. Come talk to me. See if I can help. See if we can talk it through. And if my door isn't open, you can always shoot me an email. If staff are looking for ways to improve their mental health, don't forget the staff who participate in one of the PPO medical plans at eXp pay nothing for outpatient behavioral or otherwise known as talk therapy visits. All staff get a free premium subscription to Calm. All U.S. staff can access numerous resources with Vitality, eXp's new wellness partner. Staff enrolled in a UHC medical plan at eXp have access to Care 24, which is United Healthcare's employee assistance plan. And if you have any questions about your benefits, you can message the people team at benefits@exprealty.net. And lastly, if you're experiencing a serious mental health crisis, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK or visit suicidepreventionlifeline.org and chat with a counselor. Their services are not limited, and I stress that. Even though it says Suicide Prevention Lifeline, they are not limited to suicide prevention, and they can offer assistance, even help you find help with any mental health crisis. On July 16, 2022, the Lifeline will be available as a national emergency number by dialing 988 from anywhere where you could dial 911. And encourage your loved ones and educate everyone they know about 988. You could save a life. And now we're going to move into our Q&A section. And I know that I've got this on my shared screen, so pardon me for a second while I just change that to be blank so you're not looking and looking. All right, so feel free to ask a question, and you can unmute your mic or ask it in the chat. Seeing a lot of love in the chat. Dorothy has a great point. A crisis does not mean you'll be suicidal. That's so very true.
Cody, you did a great presentation, and it helps that you have such a calming voice. It was really awesome. But can you tell me where you were able to find those statistics? Because that was pretty staggering. It was crazy.
So they are everywhere. They're out there. I actually, for a lot of the LGBT statistics, reached out to one of the companies that I admire the most, and that's the Human Rights Campaign. Um, and for other statistics, I reached out to or not reached out to, but viewed the websites for the NAACP, also the National Mental Health Alliance, the MHA.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. It's just things you don't think about, until it's brought to your attention. So I really appreciate it.
That's absolutely true and a great point. My mom always said I had a face for radio, so I appreciate the love for my voice.
Oh no. No, it's really good voice. Like I want you to have your own like piece on the Calm app. Like that's it's really good. It's good. Thank you, Cody. That's really awesome.
Thank you. Lots of people coming through. Now, I will be making a survey about this available after the fact. I don't have it ready quite yet, but we're going to put it up on the DEI workplace group, which I encourage everybody to join. I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. If anybody's got any questions, feel free. And there, Carrie dropped the link there for our mental health benefits. We really have excellent mental health benefits here. And there I just dropped the link for the DEI workplace group. Encourage everybody to go join that. I'll be sharing lots of insights and trainings and all of that kind of business. I also want to announce that we're going to be having another one of these DEI trainings coming up in June. As you know, June is our Pride Month celebration. Obviously touches my heart. I'm going to be doing a DEI training. This one's going to be shorter. It's going to be half an hour, but another open discussion where you can bring your questions and no judgment on a topic you talk about the hot button of hot topics. The biggest hot potato of a topic we've got in the LGBTQ community, pronouns. We're going to dig in. From a lesbian woman who struggled quite a bit after coming out, I appreciate this training and information. That's beautiful, Carly. Thank you for sharing. And again, for those who weren't here at the beginning, I also want to encourage you to participate in our two further Mental Health Month events on Thursday, May 19th. Is that Thursday, May 19th? Yes, because it's Thursday 10th. Today is the 12th. I can do math. Um, Thursday, May 19th is Mental Health Action Day. We are partnering with MTV, yes, that MTV that used to play music videos back at the dawn of time. MTV has this Mental Health Action Day where they have a corporate pledge you can sign, and we signed it. And what we signed it to say is that we're going to encourage everybody on our staff to take one action that day to better your mental health, whether that's take a walk with your dog, do a little yoga, visit the Calm app, go check out our mental health gym, which is wonderful. You got to go check it out. Go check out our mental health gym here in eXp world. And we also have the Sento experience, which is lovely and beautiful. And if you've never experienced one of the most relaxing things in the world, a Japanese bathhouse, we have a virtual one of those here in eXp world. So if you want to know how to get to those, I see that question. From your menu, you say go to. The third option down is mental health awareness. And there's both of those things I was telling you about, the Mind Gym and the virtual Sento wellness experience. Happy to say that in the month of June, we likely will also be having a Pride experience, Pride history experience, Uh, real impactful name to be determined. But some sort of pride experience is coming in June. Really excited about that work. And the other mental health month event that I want to highlight for you guys is coming up on May 26th. That's not next Thursday, but the Thursday after that. We've got a whole panel discussion right here on this stage about destigmatizing mental health with a powerhouse group of panelists. We're going to have our chief counsel, Jim Bramble, will be moderating this. And then our guests will be, uh, we've got Rizwana. Rizwana is a wonderful advocate for all of these DEI initiatives and a person that really speaks from a great place. We also have Deabilitor, who is one of the greatest agents I've seen raise her hand and say, "Hey, Cody, I want to help." And then we also have David Adam Kurtz, who is the leader, one of the leaders of our eXp military network, and is going to approach this topic from his background as a service member. We are coming right up on time. I just want to say, for a first time out of the gate, this was a great turnout. Thank you guys for showing up. I really enjoyed being able to share this with you. Glad you were able to take something away from it. And we really look forward to the next one. And as always, my doors are open. DEI offices, stop by and see me.